So after a few days of relative quiet in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, U.S. Central Command dropped off a few gifts for the Houthis on Valentine's Day. We've got some new graphics showing the similarities between Iranian drones and missiles and those used by the Houthis in this recent wave of attacks. No surprise, they're the same. And I have a personal opinion talking about where I think the war in Gaza is inevitably headed. We'll save that for the very end. It's a lot to get into, so I'm glad you're here. I'm recording this at 8:30 a.m. Central on Thursday, February 15th, 2024. First off, thank you all so much for being here. It's truly humbling each day that you come here to understand and learn more about the various wars and conflicts going on around the world. That said, if these are subjects that are very, very important to you, I would urge you to look at other sources. We all have our own bias. I have my own bias that I try to push back on every single day, but it manifests in ways that are sometimes hard to understand, even for yourself. So there's certain things that I don't cover. It's not intentionally or unintentionally or for any nefarious reason, but it's just the nature of being human, if you will. So especially if I say something that sounds a little bit off or maybe disagree with, I would suggest take the time, go find other sources, see what other people are saying about these things, because I'm not always right. I'm trying my best every single day. I can guarantee you that. But again, if these are subjects that are of interest to you, very, very important to you, take that time, or maybe, don't watch one of my videos one day and instead go out and find someone else and see what they have to say. I think that helps us all big picture long term. Now diving into it and starting with the Houthis down in Yemen, we got a few more attacks carried out by the Houthis over the course of the past couple days. More information from one on February 12th. This was the attack that the Houthis launched. It was a couple missiles fired at the MV Star Iris. The initial news that came out there was that it was a U.S. ship. And again, we've talked about how confusing this is between who owns it, who operates it, and what's in the cargo load, if you will. The information now coming out from Central Command is that this ship, the Star Iris, was Greek-owned, Marshall Islands flagged, and was transiting the Red Sea carrying corn from Brazil. It's the nature of international maritime shipping. There's just a little bit of every country involved in these at various times. Then on February 13th, so 2 days ago, U.S. Central Command said that they successfully conducted a self-defense strike against one Houthi mobile anti-ship cruise missile that was prepared to launch against ships in the Red Sea. And then later that day, one anti-ship ballistic missile was launched from Houthi territory into the Gulf of Aden. No reports from any ships that anything was actually struck or who even the target was of that missile launch. And then yesterday, Valentine's Day, U.S. Central Command said that they successfully conducted 4 self-defense strikes against 7 mobile anti-ship cruise missiles, 3 mobile unmanned aerial vehicles, and 1 unmanned surface vessel in Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. So 4 strikes, it could be 4 different locations, multiple munitions in each one of those strikes. That's a lot. That's not anywhere near the waves of strikes that the U.S. and U.K. have carried out previously. It doesn't quite reach that level. But 4 self-defense strikes carried out what sounds like relatively simultaneously against 3 different groupings of targets is the biggest strike we've seen by the U.S. in Yemen in a little while here. Now, I stand by the assessment or prediction a couple days ago that I think we are going to see another wave of strikes against Houthi targets all across Yemen by the U.S. and U.K. and maybe others. Hopefully, I'm wrong in that one. If I'm wrong, that means that maybe these strikes are getting the job done. But just from what we're seeing, there still continue to be attacks, either UAVs, USVs, or cruise and ballistic missiles fired at ships in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. In turn, it's hard to say that the U.S. and U.K. action at this point has actually accomplished the goal of deterring the Houthis from doing that. Now, we got a speech from the leader of the Houthi movement, Abdul Malik Badr al-Din al-Houthi, quite the name. A couple things here that I thought were interesting and worth calling out. He has these speeches pretty regularly, and you start to see some themes. A lot of the stuff is just repeated over and over again. Every so often, there's some new tidbits that I think are worth getting into. He said, quote, "The American is primarily responsible for the level of destruction and crime in Gaza and its continuation for this long period." We hear that from every one of these groups in the axis of resistance calling out the United States. The United States is responsible. And I've mentioned this because I think it is where lone wolf style attacks or jihadi groups like Islamic State or Al-Qaeda can leverage this and say, hey, look, it's the United States. It's not just Israel. So that's not necessarily surprising, but he goes a level further here. He says that the United States are flying missions over Gaza, dropping bombs ourselves, like U.S. jets and aircraft, dropping bombs in Gaza, and are planning operations for Israel to conduct in Gaza. I haven't seen any evidence of that. I don't think Israel would want us to do that to be honest. They're executing their own war. So anyways, that's the Houthi take right now, is that it's not just the United States general support, diplomatic cover and military aid and financial aid or anything like that, but that the United States military is in Gaza killing Palestinians. So that's what's coming out from the Houthis right now. I feel like that's worth knowing. He also called out Arab countries for not doing enough to aid the Palestinians. He said, quote, in exchange for American support for the enemy entity, most recently a $14 billion package announced by the American president, where is the Arab support for Palestine? He said, Arab countries have huge budgets that spend enormous amounts of money on absurd and trivial matters. I think Houthi might not have gotten the memo here that aid package is far from being passed in Congress. I think it went through the Senate, no signs that it's going to make its way through the House. But he's using that, of course, the headline that a lot of that, I think it's $14 billion, headed to Israel. So he calls that out and says, where are all the rest of the Arab countries? Where are you guys at? You got big budgets. Let's do something for the Palestinian people. Interesting that they're kind of striking that tone of trying to rally support for Gaza, if you will. And then lastly, he said the Mujahideen in Iraq did not submit or retreat despite the American targeting. I think he's wrong here. I'm having to kind of read between the lines, but if you look back at this, the major grouping of attacks carried out by the United States against these, what he's calling the Mujahideen in Iraq, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, back on February 2nd, since then, those groups have claimed responsibility for one attack against American forces. Now, there could have been a few others that slid under the radar, but for the most part, they're announcing these as soon as they happen. So Islamic resistance in Iraq has claimed one attack against U.S. forces in the region since February 2nd. That's 2 weeks. In the previous 3.5 months, there were 180 attacks, or roughly 10 per week. That is a noticeable decline. Now, it's hard to say that it has stopped because at any point it could kick back up. But I think it's hard to you look at this right now and say the only thing that changed over the last 2 weeks is the U.S. carried out a major wave of attacks against their weapon storage locations, launch facilities, communications nodes, and then a couple of the key leaders were killed in a strike. I believe it was in Baghdad. You have to take that into consideration here, and just looking at the data of what the Islamic resistance in Iraq has claimed in the last 2 weeks, it looks like that wave of attacks was at least successful in the near term of deterring those groups from continuing striking American forces. Then the Defense Intelligence Agency put out this briefing for public consumption. It's out there on the internet. Nothing classified about this in any way, shape, or form. But it's a visual comparison of Iranian missiles and drones that have been deployed by the Houthis against a variety of targets in and around Yemen. So in this report, and we'll run through some of the images here, they've got some range rings showing the ranges of the Houthi drones as well as the Houthi missiles, and then some comparisons, side-by-side comparisons, showing the Houthi munitions next to the Iranian munitions. And they're the same. They might not have come directly from Iran, but maybe the parts came from Iran, or they were Iran IRGC officials helped to assemble them in Yemen. Either way, these are not, there's too many similarities here to say it's just a coincidence, especially given the relationship between Iran and the Yemen-based Houthis. So in this report, they say since 2015, the Houthi-Iran relationship has evolved and strengthened, enabling the Houthis to effectively threaten the Yemeni government and the broader Middle East. They say the two have built a relationship likely to endure, as Iran views the Houthis as an extension of its regional power, and the Houthis look to Iran to enhance their military capabilities. No shock there. There really should not be a shock that the Houthi munitions that I'm showing here from this DIA report are Iranian munitions. Essentially, they're the same weapon. They say that between 2015 and 2023, the U.S. and its partners have interdicted at least 18 Iranian vessels that were smuggling ballistic missile components, UAVs, anti-tank guided missiles, and thousands of assault rifles and more to the Houthis. So we've intercepted these before, and now we can look. There's all different pieces of evidence here. Again, I don't think this is news or a shocker. I think it's just kind of information that needs to continually bubble up to show the level of cooperation between these two organizations. These attacks being carried out against international shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, those are essentially Iranian weapons. Right? They're maybe Iranian made. They might be smuggled in from Iran, or the various components are moved to Yemen and then assembled inside of the country by the Houthis. But either way, like there's a very, very tight relationship here between Iran and the Houthis. Again, don't think that should be much of a shock to anybody watching this channel. Then turning back to Israel here for a minute, some news came out from Lebanese media yesterday that a series of Israeli attacks in southern Lebanon killed 11 civilians, and it looks like they excluded any Hezbollah militants from that number. So in total, what we see is a lot of the Lebanese media here, especially in the southern portion of the country, will announce the civilian casualties, and then we'll have to wait and see what Hezbollah announces in terms of their own casualties separate from that. What we have right now is 196 total publicly confirmed Hezbollah militants that have been killed since October 7th. And the tit for tat there hasn't really stopped. You see these spikes every so often. I believe there was an Israeli soldier killed yesterday as well in a rocket or mortar attack. It kind of ramps up at times a little bit. It's never gotten to the point where it really seems like war is imminent at any moment. It's just kind of this low burning fire, if you will, that won't go out. So according to the IDF chief of staff yesterday, he was up north, or the reports came out of a visit he had up north where he spoke to the troops there. He said, quote, "I want you to know one thing. We are not finishing this without returning the residents to all of the communities in the north with a very high level of security." Something like 80,000, I think I've heard on the low end 80,000, the high end 130,000 Israeli civilians that have been displaced from the northern portion of the country amidst the ongoing fighting between the IDF and Hezbollah. So that's what he's talking about when he says we have to return the residents to these communities. He said, quote, "In the end, we will be ready for war. If it doesn't end in war, it will end in a compromise on the achievements. Hezbollah not on the fence. We will push back all the capabilities. It will be much quieter here. There will then be much more stability, and we will say to the residents, you can return." So just another thing to keep in mind when you're looking at this northern border. On the one hand, you might say Israel doesn't want another war. They've got their hands full. They have a lot of work still to go in Gaza, and more on that in a second here. So why would they want to bite something off like a full-scale war, a relatively conventional war in a sense, with Hezbollah up north? And on the one hand, you'd say, of course they don't want to do that. Nobody wants war. The other side of it is the persistent threat right now, the ATGM rocket and missile launches, the mortars being fired into Israeli territory up there mean that tens of thousands of Israeli citizens are internally displaced. So there's going to be a push domestically to try to get those people back into their homes, back into their communities. And, we've seen more and more footage of Israel kind of posturing on the northern border. They've moved multiple formations up north that were in Gaza previously. And they continue to conduct training exercises in terrain that would be similar to what they might face in a war with Lebanon. So again, hopefully it doesn't happen, but there's a lot of things kind of moving in that direction, unfortunately, that are going to have to be, you got to find a way out of this. If we don't want the war to escalate in the north, there's got to be a lot of stuff resolved by other means, and it's not entirely clear what that looks like right now. Then I got a question the other day. It was either an email or a DM or something where somebody had asked, where does this war go? What does success look like for Israel in Gaza? Something along those lines. And it made me realize that this hasn't really been, in my opinion, all that well addressed. And I think, bottom line up front, what this looks like is an eventual Israeli military occupation of Gaza. I could be wrong. Again, this is a personal opinion. But when we look at what Israel is facing in terms of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they are going to be able to severely degrade their military capabilities from afar, from the air, drone and missile strikes, even quick clearance operations, pushing through and then heading back out. If Israel at this point were to push through, even through Rafah, and then turn around and leave, Hamas would be significantly degraded, but they wouldn't be gone. We don't really have any good examples in recent history where an insurgency or a terrorist organization was successfully eliminated through airstrikes or a quick military operation. It just hasn't happened. It requires boots on the ground in order to make sure that organization is not able to regroup, reform, and gain the power that they once had in order to carry out something like October 7th. It's very hard to imagine how that can be done, and maybe this is just me thinking inside of a box. It's very hard to imagine how that can be accomplished without some sort of heavy security presence in the area where that entity could come back about. I don't know. So again, Israel could move through. Hamas would be significantly degraded, but entirely likely they'd be right back at it in a year, 2, 3, 5 years. So it's hard to see any scenario other than Israel having a significant, I'll say, security presence of some sort in Gaza. And that gets rough, right? I mean, again, very biased towards the American perspective. I just have a good understanding of what we've been doing in the last 20 years. We don't have that figured out. I don't know what the solution is there. There have been successful insurgencies or successful counterinsurgency campaigns throughout history, but I'm not sure that we can look to, as a whole, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, anything like that. You got to pull out little segments and where it worked in certain villages, where it worked in certain towns. But again, very, very hard for me to see any scenario where the next major phase of this looks anything. It has to look like some sort of security hold, some sort of military security oversight occupation of Gaza. If the goal truly is to eliminate Hamas and not give them the means to ever reestablish power in the Gaza Strip. But that's all I've got for now. Of course, if you're interested in learning more about war, conflict, terrorism, and all the parties involved, be sure to check out our Substack, linked in the description below. We've just brought some experts on board, analysts, writers, researchers, that are putting together some really in-depth pieces to help all of us, myself included, better understand some of the topics that are being covered in this video. All of it is free, again, linked in the description below if interested. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.